So thank you, Gabe, and thank you so much for having us here. This is a really important conversation. I'm really psyched to be here to be able to start this conversation here in San Diego at Canvas for Cause. So as we'll see that as we go through the presentation, although struggle and resistance in Palestine is not new, the idea of resisting pinkwashing and the tactic of pinkwashing is somewhat new. So we can talk about that. Okay, so a brief history of pinkwashing. So you're here to talk about Palestine. I'm going to start off talking about breast cancer. The term of pinkwashing actually was first coined in 2002 by Breast Cancer Action, which is a activist organization based in San Francisco. And the organization started in the 90s to resist corporations that were co-opting the feminist movement that had raised so much awareness already about breast cancer and inequities in healthcare and research that were happening in the United States. So in response, as the feminist movement had continued to raise awareness, corporations had actually jumped on the bandwagon. By this day and age, you know that you can't, during whatever month it is, October, right? You can't buy anything without deciding whether you're going to buy the pink ribbon one or not. Right, so you have to decide if you're going to support breast cancer or not every time you make a purchase. Breast Cancer Action called attention to the fact, with lots of other feminists, that the corporations that were behind this marketing were actually causing a lot of the toxins that are most likely responsible for causing cancer. And so this awful irony that was happening is being called out more and more, although the corporations are getting more and more on using pink ribbons more and more. So we'll see the same tactic. We'll talk about how this tactic is used now by Israel. But just very briefly again, this has started, even though there was counter-organizing to this kind of co-optation, the term pinkwashing wasn't used until 2002. And they started a campaign called Think Before You Pink, you might want to check out. And just last year, there's a documentary that was produced released that was called Pink Ribbons, Inc. So if you want to check that out, it's actually streaming on Netflix. Okay, so why do we use the term with pinkwashing with Israel? So many corporations have been accused of using women's issues, using gay issues, or using environmental issues to cover up the kind of atrocities, the kind of things that they're doing around the world. So pinkwashing in Israel is to call attention to how the state of Israel is actually using gay rights and gay culture and gay movements and the success of gay movements to cover up what we're going to talk about soon, Israeli apartheid. So that term actually was first used, to our knowledge, by the editor of Electronic Intifada in 2010, and he used that term to, again, talk about how queers and LGBT folks were being used and our struggles were being used by Israel. And he also talked about brainwashing and whitewashing. Okay, the first time, one of the first times, so this is very recent, right? 2010, the first time pinkwashing is actually talked about, and then 2011, Sarah Schulman actually landed an op-ed in the New York Times describing pinkwashing. So very quickly, we're getting a lot of movement around organizing against pinkwashing, and in the New York Times, it's actually called pinkwashing. And then a year later, now other mainstream press, NPR, in talking about, this is an article that appeared in NPR 2012, last year, June. Israel presents itself as a haven for gay community. So Israel is going and selling itself as a gay haven. In the article, by the end of the article, they also, to be fair in reporting, actually talked about how critics are accusing the government of what they call pinkwashing. So this term has actually very quickly been taken up by not just activists, but it's actually in the mainstream media. There's conversations happening right now. And so the way the NPR news story described it, they said gay groups that support the Palestinian bid for an independent state use the phrase to describe Israel's public relations strategy. They charge that the Israeli government is highlighting the rights enjoyed by the gay community in Israel to obscure the occupation of the Palestinians. We're going to expand that definition of what we're calling attention to during this presentation, but that's the basic idea. So the question that we'd like to move to right now is, and I'll hand it over to Nasser, is to describe what do that Israel is covering up.
There you go. Before I begin, I always like to think of lectures as first dates. This is the first time I'm meeting some of you, the first time you're meeting me, and so there must have been something of interest that got us together. Maybe if you hated the title, you wanted to come, whatever. It doesn't matter. So just a little bit about me. I grew up in Egypt, in Cairo. I'm Palestinian, but I grew up in Cairo. And I came to the US, to New York in 1981 to study, and then stayed on for 20 years in New York and came to San Diego for work. And I'm a businessman. I have nothing to do really with politics in my regular work. I have a software company, and I go to China all the time. So my work world is software, China, and then my politics, in addition to Palestine, are also focused on civil rights. So I'm a member of the ACLU, a member of the board here in San Diego, and I focus on civil rights and civil liberties. So that's a little bit about me. I'll get to know more about you in the question and answer period, but this way you get to know where I'm coming from, because every person has their background and biases that come through in the way we think about things. So I just want to be open about that. So why do we talk about Israeli apartheid and pinkwashing Israel? If Israel was a great country, we wouldn't be talking about this, right? So maybe Holland talks about gay rights, well, that example. Maybe Sweden talks about gay rights, and it's mostly a pretty good country. It doesn't really invade other countries most of the time, doesn't oppress too many people, and so on. So nobody picks on Sweden, right? But when a country like the US uses gay rights to say how great it is, to silence people from criticizing the US war on Iraq, or the US targeted assassinations by drones, or so on, US policies, that's wrong. That's called pinkwashing. They're trying to cover up atrocities by saying how great we are because we're great to gay people, or we became great to gay people. Israel is an apartheid state. Why do I say that? It's a big claim, because the word apartheid is what was used to describe the white supremacist government of South Africa. And the word apartheid is Afrikaans for segregation. That's all it means. So the US South was apartheid during the segregation era, where whites and blacks had different rules, different bathrooms, different buses, everything. Israel is not exactly like South Africa. Every country has a different situation. But the reality is, it's a country that says it's a Jewish state, it's a state for the Jewish people. And the indigenous Palestinians, like me, who happen not to be Jewish, are a problem for that country. They're not part of that country, they're not part of the state, even though we've been on the land before the state was founded. And so we have unequal treatment, different laws that apply to us, different treatment, and so on. So, just to remind people, there is actually an actual definition that the UN came up with. What does apartheid mean? And it's best described here in this Rome statute in 2002. It just says it's an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. So whenever you privilege one group over another, that's apartheid. That's segregation and so on. That's what it means. Right? It doesn't mean South Africa, it doesn't mean whites versus blacks, it could be in any place in the world. So in Israel, I'm going to go through three types of things that demonstrate why Israel is an apartheid. And I'll be quoting from people like Desmond Tutu from South Africa. First is land apartheid. So if you are Jewish and you immigrate to Israel, you could be born in San Diego or you become an instant citizen, and you have the right to own land in anywhere in Israel. That's your right. If it's available and for sale, you can write. For Palestinians like me, even people, my grandmother comes from a city within Israel, so not from the West Bank, it's Safed, within northern Israel, in the Galilee. I cannot own land in 93% of Israel. It's outside the possibility for non-Jews to buy. Because that land is controlled by either the state or by the Jewish National Fund. And the Jewish National Fund was founded to enable Jews to own land and to cultivate Jewish land. And so, by definition, they don't allow non-Jews to partake in their project. And so, de facto, Palestinians are not allowed to own 90% of their historical land. in the 1967, the areas that Israel occupied militarily in the 1967 war, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem, they're all under military occupation. So they're not normal territories. You know, there's military and it's under military occupation. And in effect, Palestinians even there have access to less than 10% of that land. Because the remaining 90% are taken for security reasons, for checkpoints, for a bunch of other excuses of the Israeli government. And so in reality, a Jew can own anywhere, a Palestinian cannot. Huge difference in a basic right of land ownership. To demonstrate this, if you go from the left to the right, the green areas, and that goes from before 1947 all the way to the left, or to my right, sorry, that way, to your left, and this is the current situation. The green areas demonstrated the areas that Palestinians owned before the State of Israel was founded. So before the State of Israel was founded, Jews owned about 7% of the land of Palestine. Mostly those were either indigenous Jews, Palestinian Jews, who lived there for centuries, and like me, they just happened to be Jewish, or immigrants that came from Europe from the end of the 19th century until the State of Israel was founded, mostly from Eastern Europe, from Russia and so on, until the Holocaust, and then there were a lot of people from Germany and so on. And a lot of these owned kibbutzes, and they founded communities and cities and so on. That's the white areas you see all the way here. When the State of Israel was founded, the UN partitioned 1947 the land. This was the result of the partition. The white areas are Israel, or lands dedicated to the Jewish state, and the green areas are lands that the United Nations assigned to the Arab state of Palestine. Immediately after, what we call Al-Nakba, like Gabe said, which is the day of catastrophe for us, and Israelis get incensed because we're calling the day of independence our day of catastrophe, but that's the reality. This is what happened. You know, one day we lose 80% of our historic land. And that's the State of Israel becomes the white area, and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the green areas, become the 1967 areas, which then Israel occupies in 1967. So Israel now occupies the whole land. And today, these are the pieces that Palestinians control. That's it, from historical Palestine. So if you're in the shoes of a Palestinian, I didn't do anything to the Jews in Europe. I did not commit the Holocaust. Europeans did that. And then they resolved the Jewish problem in Europe by creating a Palestinian problem in Palestine and pitting European Jews against Palestinians, and in the end we got screwed. That's the reality. We're the victims of Europe. And Europe, of course, never occurred to Europeans to solve the Jewish problem in Europe. To give, the Jews a stake in Europe, God forbid, they're not Europeans, they should be living there. And we never think of Europe when we think of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The media always talks about these people have been fighting forever. This is all created by Germany and Britain and France. That's who created this conflict. It didn't exist before they meddled into this. And then they have nothing to do with it now. They're like clean. This is all these crazy barbaric people fighting each other. They have nothing to do with it. We've seen this in many places around the world. People apartheid. I'm not going to talk about a lot of things. The most shocking example, there's a lot of examples here, but this is the most shocking example. Somebody who's Palestinian, this may be my grandfather, who may still have the key to his house inside Israel, is never allowed to go back. But Israel doesn't allow any Palestinian refugee to go back to their home. Any Jew from anywhere in the world, from New York, 2006, can take their family and become instant citizens. And they're giving a home, and they become instant citizens. That is a problem. So somebody whose centuries, the family lived there, cannot go back. And somebody who doesn't really have a connection to the land physically, they have an ideological connection, maybe a religious connection, can become a citizen right away. So that to me explains why it's apartheid. And it's not only Palestinians that say that. So leading South Africans, who should know one or two things about apartheid, because they lived in it. So the leading South African figure in apartheid was Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the head of the Anglican Church of South Africa. And he has been to Palestine many times, and he said some of the conditions are actually worse than in South Africa. Because South Africa never kicked out the blacks from South Africa. They were displaced and so on, but they remained in South Africa. It never questioned their right to be there, right? It questioned the right to be equal human beings, but not to live there. Israel destroyed the right of the Palestinians to live in that peace and created a whole project to deny that right through media and films and so on. And so we are treated almost like immigrants in our own land. And Israel to this day say, which country would allow 6 million people to come to it? Well, we're not 6 million people. We are the original inhabitants of that land. And so that's what's going on. Then there are other, John Dugard, a very big lawyer in South Africa, in the UN, the rapporteur, and he says elements of the occupation, he's a lawyer, so he's very, very careful choosing his words, resemble that of colonialism and apartheid. And so on. South African Human Sciences Research Council, South African Christian leaders, and so on and so forth. If you just Google South Africans on Israeli apartheid, you get pages and pages and pages. And the most compelling example is the South African government today has endorsed officially the campaign that I'll talk about later on for boycotting and divesting from Israel because they consider Israel to be an apartheid state. So it's gone a long way in South Africa. The third aspect is really violations of international law and Palestinian human rights. And I'm just going to quickly go through what leading human rights organizations say. So probably the most important human rights organization in the world is the International Committee of the Red Cross. It's mainstream, we may hate it sometimes, but it's the most credible organization. And they basically call Gaza, the Gaza Strip, and a prison, right? And the siege of Gaza being completely against international law. So Israel says we withdrew from Gaza, we have nothing to do with Gaza, but they control the border, the sea, the water, anything that goes into Gaza has to be controlled. They don't allow anything in. They control the Gaza Strip, they occupy it. It's an open-air prison. Even David Cameron, the Prime Minister of Britain, said it was an open-air prison when he was siege. I mean, this caused a row between Great Britain and Israel, but he couldn't, he was shocked by that. Human Rights Watch had a full report about how Israel has two policies for Jewish population versus the Palestinians with regards to water and roads and so many things that constitute violations of international law. And then an excellent report came out in 2011 by a group, Amnesty International, Christian Aid, Oxfam, many other human rights organizations, and they all talk about the blockade of Gaza as against international law. So these three aspects, the land apartheid, the people apartheid, and the violation of Palestinian human rights, is what's causing us to call Israel an apartheid state and to point out that the policy of Israel to make itself appear like a Western democracy is washing or trying to hide their crimes through either whitewashing or greenwashing, known as Israel's environmental record, or now pinkwashing, which we will talk about more in this talk.